Okay, so I am really delighted to welcome Lydia as our speaker for the third research seminar of this term's series. And so let me just introduce Lydia to you. So after completing her postgraduate studies in physics and mathematics at the University of Cologne and in theology at the Seminar for Evangelical Theology in Sociology, Dr. Jaeger obtained her PhD in philosophy at the Sorbonne on the possible links between the concept of law of nature and religious presuppositions. She holds a permanent lectureship and is academic dean at the Institut Unique de NonRectionism in France. She's also a research associate of St. Edmund's College in Cambridge, a Faraday Associate of the Faraday Institute of Science and Religion, and a KLC Research Fellow at Copenhagen Centre for Public Theology in Cambridge. Her current research interests in natural order, the epistemological and ethical implications of the doctrine of creation, the theology of science, and our understanding of human persons in the light of evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and philosophy. Lydia is also the author of seven books and numerous articles on the relation between Christianity and sciences. So I'm delighted to welcome Lydia to speak to us. She's going to speak about why theology needs science and why science is theology. So without further ado, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words, for the good introduction. Faraday has been an important, in fact, ingredient, if I may say, in my journey in science and theology over the years. So I've learned a lot and had a lot of good interaction with people from Faraday or people attending courses, etc. So thank you for this. So why theology needs science and why science needs theology? It seems to me that in our time and culture, most are very well of the pitfalls that threaten us when we don't make a clear distinction between science and theology. Therefore, this seminar will simply assume this distinction as commonly accepted background knowledge. Being careful not to conflate science and theology, I will nevertheless set out to present fruitful interactions between science and theology, which do, in fact, exist. Or at least this is the claim I hope to convince you of in the next half an hour or so. Before talking about possible interactions between science and theology, you may want to know in which sense I'll use these two terms. I'm afraid that I won't provide any rigorous definition, as such an enterprise would easily take up the whole seminar. Instead, I'll be working with a pragmatic definition. Loosely stated, theology is what is done in a theology department of a university, or at a seminary, or a training college for pastors and missionaries. And science is what is done in a science department of a university or a lab. My own background is physics, therefore my main focus will be on natural sciences. But in several examples, I'll broaden the perspective and include examples from the human sciences, insofar as they strive to implement the same methodological rigor as the natural sciences. In terms of possible interactions between science and theology, what follows will resemble somewhat of a laundry list, covering a range of rather diverse topics. This is a deliberate choice because my aim is not to construct a general model describing what science and theology interactions should look like, but rather to develop a more pragmatic piecemeal approach. Given the actual practices of science and theology, what are fruitful avenues for interaction between these two fields? I've chosen to present as many avenues as possible for bringing together science and theology, at least as possible during a 40 minutes talk. I hope that this rather impressionistic procedure will stretch your imagination so that you will be able to work out for yourself the details of the different suggestions. So let us first see what science can contribute to theology, before turning later to examine what theology can contribute to science. Let me start by pointing out very practical benefits which science has offered to theology. The most essential benefit goes largely unnoticed as we take it for granted. Scientifically informed medicine has hugely expanded the average time span during which theologians, like other humans, are able to live healthy lives and thus to pursue their work. Resources provided range from a pair of glasses, which allow middle-aged and older scholars to continue to read and write, to sophisticated medical drugs and treatments, which allow to heal or delay so many illnesses which took their toll in previous ages, and lest we forget, continue to do so in other less privileged places on our planet even today. Humans are the most precious resource in any enterprise, including academic research. What would be left if most theologians were unable to continue to work beyond 40 or 50? What a wealth of experience, knowledge, or wisdom would be lost. By the way, the same is true for scientists. Although younger scientists are certainly more open to explore new promising avenues of research, the wisdom of the older teacher is necessary for providing a framework in which to develop research skills. Not only does science allow theologians to be active for longer, it also provides technical resources that are useful for theological studies. Computers are capable of handling large databases and thus have made significant contributions in the lexical and syntactic study of sacred texts. And the internet allows worldwide collaboration among experts. Allow me to provide just one example of the kind of new evidence that has emerged in theology using computer tools. Richard Bauckham, in his Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, studies the frequencies of Jewish personal names in the New Testament Gospels and Acts, and compares them to current knowledge of Jewish names in the ancient world. And you can see some of the figures on the computer screen. This study was only made possible by the extensive use of IT tools. It shows that the relative frequency of personal names in the New Testament Gospels corresponds to what we know of Palestinian Jewish names at the time, whereas the relative frequencies of Jewish names among the diaspora or Gentile names were very different. Therefore, the New Testament Gospels reflect faithfully the relative frequencies of Jewish names in the first century Palestine. A feature difficult to produce for anybody who might try to invent such stories. And this demonstrates that the Gospel writers had access to first-hand information about the life of Jesus. Second, beyond providing helpful tools, science also offers theologians a model for a rigorous method of research. To be sure, the differences between science and theology should not be underestimated. Nevertheless, there are similarities as well. Both domains have an ultimate source of authority. Natural order, explored by observation and experiment for natural science. Holy Scriptures for theology, at least for the religions of the book. In both fields, the construction of theories and knowledge from the ultimate source of authority is not a straightforward inductive process. Background assumptions and research paradigms prevalent in the scholarly community play a vital role. Science has an impressive success record, and theologians may well benefit from paying close attention to what they can learn from scientists in terms of method. This is even more so for historic forms of Christian theology, as they have a stronger emphasis on facts than liberal forms of Christian theology. In line with the Apostle Peter's claim, I quote, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Note the emphasis on eyewitness reports, on facts, not myths. In this understanding, at least, theology, like science, is aiming at factual truth. Therefore, although the object of study is different, and therefore the method of research is also, theologians may well gain some insights from their scientific colleagues on how to pursue truth in a communal effort. The French Enlightenment philosopher and scientist Descartes considered that regular exposure to mathematics would help in his critical thinking. As a preparation for his intellectual aesthetic undertaking, which would lead in due course to his famous cogito ergo sum, Descartes writes, "I reserved some hours from time to time which I expressly devoted to the solution of mathematical difficulties." I sometimes tell my theology students that we should introduce a compulsory math class in our curriculum. In general, they aren't very pleased at the prospect, although I think it's mainly because maths is badly taught. But I side with Descartes and consider that immersion in mathematics and rigorously conducted science is an excellent training field for logical thinking and stringent problem solving, even for theologians. Beyond providing technical tools and a model for searching after the truth, science offers knowledge which theologians would be better off using. I want to specifically focus on scientific knowledge useful for the interpretation of sacred texts. It is rather uncontroversial that science, understood in a very broad sense, can and should inform exegesis, insofar as one considers linguistics, archaeology, and ancient history as scientific disciplines. The use of knowledge gained from natural sciences is a much more controversial subject. Should information gained from, say, astronomy or biology inform the theologian's reading of sacred texts? The answer depends on how they consider these texts. If they go with the Jewish saying that the Torah speaks in the language of humans, they should try to keep the right balance between two methodological principles. First, when it comes to establishing the meaning of a text, exegesis proper should only be constrained by knowledge accessible to the human author himself. Only in this way is the human side taken seriously. It implies that the sacred texts are situated in specific historical and cultural settings. In a second step, knowledge not available to the human author may inform exegesis as an internal motivation for checking the solidity of our understanding, assuming that the human text is also divine revelation. As long as one believes in an omniscient and benevolent deity, knowledge gained from nature and knowledge derived from scripture can't be in opposition. Therefore, when we encounter a contradiction, something has gone wrong in the process of interpretation. In this way, scientific knowledge can legitimately challenge our understanding of the texts. But beware, this is not a one-way process. The apparent contradiction may just as easily result from an overestimation of what we know in terms of science. Thus, scientific knowledge may provide a corrective for exegesis, but also theology may provide a corrective for the sciences. More on this later. when we turn to the question of what scientists can learn from theologians. Let me illustrate how these two principles work together by an example from my own experience. I had long believed that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. This is what Jesus says in the parable of the mustard seed, or so I thought. One day, somebody challenged me, pointing out that the seed of an orchid is even smaller. He concluded that Jesus was voicing the received wrong knowledge of his time. But this was unacceptable to me, as Jesus' words are totally trustworthy and therefore true. I went back to the gospel text, and in this case, the solution was ready at hand. In the parable, Jesus speaks, I quote, of a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. The following statement about the mustard seed being the smallest of all seeds must be understood in this context. It is not meant as a general statement about all seeds, but about the seeds a farmer in Jesus' day routinely used. Thus, here's an example where scientific knowledge legitimately changed my understanding of a biblical text. But observe how science comes in. The meaning of the text has to be established in its own right, without bringing in knowledge foreign to the context of the author. But when a contradiction with science arises, it can motivate us to go back and check if we got the textual interpretation right. Fourth, providing a better understanding of the world in which theologians are called to live and proclaim the faith. Our culture is heavily influenced by science. Thus, theologians need scientists if they want to understand the world in which they are called to serve. The evangelical Anglican of international stature, John Stott, spoke of dual listening. I quote, "I believe we are called to the difficult and even painful task of double listening. That is, we are to listen carefully, although of course with differing degrees of respect, both to the ancient word and to the modern world, in order to relate the one to the other with a combination of fidelity and sensitivity." This task of double listening can't be achieved without paying close attention to the science. Examples abound. If theologians want to foster creation care, believing that humans are stewards of God's creation, they need to pay attention to what science has taught us about the proper functioning of ecosystems. Applications range from providing at least some niches for wildlife in our neighborhood to effective lifestyle changes which may help to slow down global climate change. And medical science has had an enormous impact on human experience at the beginning and the end of human life. In the West, both birth and death are experienced in a hugely different way from traditional societies. There are numerous ethical questions unheard of even a century ago, which now faces us due to our increased technological capabilities. None of these existential ethical concerns can be appropriately answered without drawing on expert scientific knowledge. Having examined several ways in which science can be a gift to theology, let us now turn to possible venues for theology to make a constructive contribution to science. In what follows, I will mainly focus on Christian theology, as this is the faith tradition in which I work. Whoever endeavors to claim any fruitfulness of theology for science encounters the objection that science is practiced by scientists of all faiths and none. Is this not proof enough that theology has to be kept out of science? I beg to differ. Yes, science is the most successful interfaith and interethnic project in our contemporary world, which is so often torn apart by religious conflicts. and ethnic conflicts dressed up as religious. But this doesn't mean that theology has no positive role to play in science. To begin with, the biblical doctrines of creation and sin were influential in the birth of modern science. Why then should theology have no resources to offer to science even today? Of course, the very same doctrine of creation explains the possibility of doing science without explicit reference to God. This is because, contrary to animistic or pantheistic worldviews, creation establishes a clear distinction between the divine and the world, so that it becomes possible to describe nature in terms of reference defined by creaturely things themselves. I take the expression from Walter Thorson. But distinction doesn't amount to separation. Christian theology claims to draw on the word of the very same God who created the world that science explores. Thus, it may well have some insights to offer for the practice of science. The best way of proving this claim is to show you several examples of how theology can benefit science. Once again, I've chosen 4 of them. First, setting the metaphysical framework for science. It wasn't by happenstance that modern science emerged in a context deeply steeped in the biblical worldview. Admittedly, we need to guard ourselves from monocausal explanations. There were other influential factors in the emergence of modern science. But the Christian mindset played a crucial role, as many excellent historical studies have shown. This is not surprising, as presuppositions of the scientific method sit well with the biblical understanding of the world and of humanity's place in it. Let me present just 2 examples of how the biblical worldview provides a metaphysical framework for the scientific method. First, one of the defining features of modern science is the role of planned experimental activity. Newton and his disciples explicitly appealed to the contingency of creation in order to justify their empiricism. Roger Coitz, who oversaw the publication of the 2nd edition of the Principia, writes in the preface, "From this fountain, the will of God, it is that those laws which we call the laws of nature have flowed, in which there appear many traces indeed of the most wise contrivance, but not the least shadow of necessity. These, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observations and experiments." Second, not only did the new experimental method feed on creation, but also, perhaps more surprisingly so, on sin. Drawing on a wide range of primary sources, right from antiquity to early modern times, the historian of science Peter Harrison points to the importance of the strong Augustinian conception of original sin put forth by the Protestant reformers. Some early modern thinkers sought to find in logic and mathematics a stronghold untouched by the corruption of the fall, from which to construct certain knowledge. Others considered that the Genesis text, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread," set the paradigm for gaining knowledge about the natural world. Through laborious and cooperative experimentation, the Adamic curse could be partially reversed. The experimental philosophy of Francis Bacon illustrates this view. I quote, "For man by the fall fell at the same time from his state of innocence and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses, however, can even in this life be in some part repaired. The former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and sciences." Thus, contrary to those who link the emergence of early modern science to the Enlightenment optimism, Peter Harrison considers that the birth, I quote, "the birth of modern experimental science was not attended with a new awareness of the powers and capacities of human reason, but rather the opposite, the consciousness of the manifold deficiencies of the intellect, of the misery of the human condition, and of the limited scope of scientific achievement." Second, not only does the biblical worldview provide a science-friendly metaphysics and thus favor the emergence of modern science. Even today, scientists may need a helping hand from theologians in order to better disseminate scientific findings in some contexts. Such contexts include the following. First, religious motivated opposition to scientific knowledge. Cosmological and biological theories of origin offer a prime example. Conservative Christians and Muslims will not accept scientific reconstructions if they cannot see how these can be reconciled with the teaching of their sacred texts. And second, deficient performances of other channels of transmission, as schools or public media. The lack of efficiency may be due to a lack of resources in the wider societies. Missionaries in developing countries have long been involved in the furthering of school teaching, including science classes and public health education. It may also be linked to the rapid expansion of scientific knowledge in a certain field, which implies that more usual contexts of science teaching are insufficient. COVID-19 vaccination provides a very contemporary example. If I may use a personal illustration, the leadership in my local church put some effort into helping members correctly understand the risk-benefit balance of vaccination. Probability calculus is not the most easily understood part of mathematics, and well-informed religious leaders may help in reaching population groups which are not easily reached through other channels. I will now turn to a controversial topic. I will claim that theology not only maps out the appropriate framework for the scientific method, but that it provides knowledge which can challenge or complement scientific findings. Such a claim immediately raises eyebrows, or worse, it sets off inner alarm bells, and rightly so to a certain extent. There have been far too many preposterous proposals made in this area. Misinterpretations of scripture were held against genuine scientific insights. Literal readings were forced on biblical texts, with literary genres favoring non-literal readings. All twisted claims about scientific results were made in order to align science with one favorite understanding of the sacred texts. Despite all these instances, where theological knowledge has been misused in science, I still hold to the claim that theology may provide truths that play a legitimate role in science. Ever since Kant, we have become accustomed to the separation between facts and values. Science providing knowledge about the facts, and theology offering insights into values. But why accept such a restricted view of theology, and of science, by the way? Why decide a priori that theology has nothing factual to contribute to the vast domain of scientific knowledge? Given the ever-increasing scope of questions which the sciences address, this would limit the relevance of theology rather drastically. In particular, the study of scriptural revelation may well lead to truth claims which are relevant for science. This makes life more dangerous for those working at the intersection of science and theology, but it also holds the promise of true interdisciplinary collaboration involving scientists and theologians. Not only should theology listen to science, it should also be allowed a place at the table as an equal dialogue partner. This directly follows from non-reductionism, acknowledging that the scientific method is one among several legitimate approaches to reality, including theology. Each approach offers a specific perspective on reality and has to learn from the others. I'm aware that my claim is somewhat countercultural, and that I would need to boil state by a thoroughly worked out epistemology, correctly articulating scientific and theological truth claims. Instead of getting started on this fascinating but challenging project, I will provide you with 4 examples, 2 taken from the natural sciences and 2 from the human sciences. I hope that they may help you to see more precisely what I'm thinking about. So, starting with natural sciences, first the beginning of the universe. There was no observational evidence, no rigorous theoretical model for the beginning of the universe in time before well into the 20th century. In fact, it was Einstein's general relativity which first provided a rigorous scientific framework for an evolving universe. Although Einstein himself didn't like the idea because of his Spinozism. Major observational evidence was provided in the 1920s by Hubble and in the 1960s by the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation. 19th century so-called scientific materialism was turned into a political ideology in Marxism. It held that matter was eternal, as ancient Greek scientists had held before. Throughout all these centuries, Jews and Christians knew from scriptural revelation that the world had an origin in time, although no scientific information was available. Obviously, the two sources of knowledge should not be conflated, but theological knowledge could have guarded against interpreting the absence of scientific evidence as evidence for the absence of a beginning in time. Second, Martin Rudwig, Professor Emeritus at the University of California and Research Associate at HBS here in Cambridge, has done fascinating research on the historical turn which the earth sciences took at around 1800, when they abandoned the project of understanding everything solely in terms of unchanging historical laws of nature. And instead transposed, I quote Martin Rudwig, the methods and concepts from the writing of human history into the study of the earth in order to reconstruct the earth's own history. In a nutshell, Rudwig sees 2 dynamics at work during this period concerning the relationship between geology and theological claims specifically built on the biblical story of Noah's flood. First, it provides a good example of the general human learning process by which the appropriate fields of application of diverse claims to reliable knowledge come to be recognized and differentiated. And second, at the same time, the geohistorical research strategy was positively facilitated by the strongly historical orientation of the Christian religion, the strong sense of an unrepeated directional movement in human history, not deterministic or predictable, but always contingent. I continue to quote, the overarching Judeo-Christian sense of human history as complex, unrepeated, and above all contingent lies at the very roots of the modern earth sciences. Contemporary examples of theology providing relevant knowledge to the sciences tend to be more controversial. One relatively safe example, I think, comes now from the human sciences. the treatment of religious practices and beliefs in sociological field studies. Often, but fortunately not always, one can observe a reductionist approach to religion. In a secular mindset, religion just can't be about what it claims to be, an encounter with the supernatural realm. In a secular mindset, religion must be something different. But theology challenges these reductionist views of religion and can therefore help sociologists to engage in more open-minded research. Although I'm only an outside observer, it seems to me that more recent ethnological studies in non-Western societies tend to adopt a less reductionist, more sympathetic approach to religion, trying to get inside the mindset of the people they observe and allow them to speak for themselves. The supernatural is such a prevalent feature of non-Western outlooks on reality that it is hard inside a reductionist framework to get even a moderately adequate description of how they function. But when it comes to sociological research conducted in Western societies, the secular mindset still often prevails. This may even influence public policy making. Religious fundamentalist violence is often explained in terms of socioeconomic causes. Thus, measures taken to prevent radicalization or to de-radicalize those who have been radicalized tend to neglect proper religious categories such as the need for spirituality or for transcendent meaning in life. Another potentially more contentious example concerns taking sin into account in psychology and sociology. From a Christian perspective, it is to be expected that no satisfactory description of human inner life and outside behavior can be obtained without the category of sin. But sin is an inherently theological category. Human beings are sinners because of their broken relationship with God. In the sciences, as in all human inquiry, one will only find what one is looking for. And as a result, the insight provided by Scripture can sharpen our discernment to see certain facts that would otherwise have remained unnoticed. As Pascal wrote, "For myself, I confess that so soon as the Christian religion reveals the principle that human nature is corrupt and fallen from God, that opens my eyes to see everywhere the mark of this truth. For nature is such that she testifies everywhere, both within man and without him, to a lost God and a corrupt nature." Let me conclude with a central biblical teaching that does not imply scientific knowledge claim as such, but is nevertheless crucial in providing guidance for scientific practice. I speak here of the Genesis affirmation that human beings are created in the image of God. It's not straightforward to see how this claim links to scientific evidence. Can the divine image be recognized in genetic, cognitive, linguistic, cultural traits, or in none of them? It's not easy to decide. But whatever your favorite view on this is, the claim that humans are made in the image of God endows them with a non-negotiable dignity. And this has multifaceted relevance for scientific practice. First, human dignity is inviolable, as stated in the first article of the German Constitution. It was adopted in 1949. And this first sentence in the first article of what is called the Basic Law tragically echoes back to the horrors of the Nazi regime, in which science played its part. not least by medical experimentation performed on prisoners and so-called racially inferior persons. As scientifically valuable as results obtained in such experiments may be, human dignity sets ethical limits on experiments that we dare not transgress. This may frustrate the desire for omniscience and omnipotence, of which scientists are not immune. But the abomination of Nazi medical research stands as a permanent warning that science should never cross this Rubicon again. And second, not only are humans involved in scientific experiments worthy of special protection, so are fellow scientists. If one takes seriously the biblical teaching that humans are created in God's image, respect is due to colleagues with whom we work and students whom we teach. Fortunately, many scientists reach this conclusion even without referring explicitly to this theological insight. Nevertheless, science is a very competitive enterprise, and therefore it may help to listen to the Apostle Paul's admonition: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than ourselves. And could Jesus' command to love our enemies also mean that we should pay due homage to the accomplishments of scientists which compete with our research institution? And finally, on a very personal level, the scientist, him or herself, is also created in God's image. This implies both a daunting responsibility and a God-given dignity. First, for the responsibility. If one accepts this perspective, it means that scientists are held responsible for the work accomplished in science, judged for its moral value. And second, for the dignity. If I know that I'm created in God's image, I understand that my value as a person doesn't depend on the success of my scientific work. And this can strengthen my resilience in the face of failure, when a paper in which I have invested a lot of time, energy, and money is turned down. Or when a long-running experiment in the end doesn't provide any usable results. Or when I'm driven out of the job because of personal rivalries. In the face of life's difficulties, theology may offer a hope which scientists may well be in need of. Thank you for your attention, and now over to questions.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for your talk. And yeah, we now have the opportunity for some Q&A. And I can see there's a few questions that have come in online already, but does anyone in the room have a question you'd like to ask?
Thank you very much. Please give me a short answer for little people about the days of creation.
Okay. This is, it links to what I said about the use of how to use knowledge from natural science coming into biblical exegesis. So if you take the two principles which I have outlined, you can't use what we know from natural sciences in order to decide what the Genesis texts tell us. But you have to check on how an original reader in the original context would read these texts. And I think there are good clues in the text itself for non-literal reading, although I'm not going to develop this because you want a short answer. But I just point you back to the principles which you should use in reading the Genesis text.
Well, shall we go to an online question? So, well, there was a question actually right back from, I think, your second or third slide of the talk, where you were comparing the frequency of the Jewish name. So this is a very specific question, asking what was the general source that was compared to the Gospels and Acts?
Okay, I don't. So the work was done by Richard Bauckham in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he worked on a database. Okay, so Bauckham draws on data covering the whole period from 330 BC to 200 AD. But the majority of the occurrences come from sources dating from the 1st and early 2nd century. That is Joseph, New Testament, Judean desert text, Masada, Jerusalem, Osiris, and the earliest rabbinic sources. And yeah, the frequencies of the first names seem to be relatively stable during this period.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. It's a very fascinating result, because when you read the Gospels, for example, you see that there are several Marys. It always gets very, very confusing to know which Mary is talked of. But this is exactly, in fact, how personal names functioned at that time in this area. It's a very intriguing feature of the Gospel text. Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have another question in the room? Yes, please.
Aquinas is reputed to have said that science was the handmaid of theology. And so he implied that the balance of expressive power and persuasion lay with theology. In your opinion, has that balance of power shifted in the present day? So who has the upper hand?
Do you mean in culture in general, or how it should be, in my view? So I think if you say in at least in the West, or if you look at the current situation, I think science has certainly the upper hand. If you ask me for what I would want to see, I would want to see equal dialogue partners. So neither theology controlling science nor science controlling theology, but talking to each other and allowing each other to bring in their perspectives, their knowledge claims, and to work together for the common good.
So we have another question online, which is about the ways in which theology has influenced science and technological advances. So it says, what about historical contributions to scientific and technological advances in non-Christian societies, in China, the Islamic world? Can this be attributed to the influence of Christian missionaries, or did similar methods and advances develop independently within other worldviews?
Okay, so I'm slightly getting out of my field of expertise here. When it comes to China, Joseph Needham has made the very controversial claim that China didn't develop natural science as we know it from the West because of the lack of the idea of a divine lawgiver. So this has been, I think Joseph Needham knew something about the Chinese culture, but his claim is controversial. So obviously when in China, when you stay with China, so there were Jesuit missionaries in the 17th, 18th century, making some contributions. But on the technological development, obviously China was earlier than the West on several points. So I think you have to be very careful on what you compare, what you mean, and you can certainly point to influences of other religious worldviews on, say, science or similar cultural undertakings, what you would call science. But then you have to really be careful and to look at every case study.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. Right, another question in the room. Do we have another question in the room?
Fine, thank you very much. You're very pragmatic in your approach, so I want to ask a very pragmatic question in spirit. So if you were to design how university or higher education should teach scientists and theologians that reflect this framework being provided, how would you design that? And I would just ask if higher education is that at least reflecting one of your points.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, in fact, I teach in a small theological college, and which has the advantage of being completely free of designing our curriculum. So, and to be honest, I've never put any maths class in the curriculum, although I still think it would be a good thing to do. So you can, yeah. I didn't put into practice my own feelings, but what I certainly try to do, so speaking on theology, what I try to do is to bring our students in contact with students from science or with scientists. So we had a very interesting experiment, at least I really enjoyed it. So I teach an evening class in apologetics, and for the last 2 times, we had scientists joining us, so either doctorate students from science or postdocs. And when I talked to some of my students in theology, so training for church ministry, at the first time they said, oh, I don't want to think about these difficult questions. So why would I bother about, say, this, how to link Christian theology with neurosciences, for example? And then to one of them I said, but then imagine you're a pastor of a church where somebody is struggling with these questions. So even if you are not interested in this question, how can you be a good pastor to somebody struggling with these questions? And then he started to think, and I think, so I hope that something will come out of this contact. So what would I do when it comes to teaching science? I think we should have something on the history of science, and which is much broader than just learning how to do science in a practical way. I had the chance, when I did physics, we had one university professor who was very much interested in the philosophy of physics. And he did even courses that they weren't part of the curriculum. You could just turn up and then go to these classes. And there were quite a few, in fact, students coming along to these classes, although we didn't get credit for it and there were no exams. But at least it helped us to get thinking about, say, more philosophical questions. And I think you could do something similar to history of science. And then we at least, we never had any class on ethics, which I think we should have. I don't know how it's these days. There is something about this.
Yeah. So we'll just go and take one more question online, because we have quite a few great questions that have come in online as well. And this one is related to neuroscience. So recent neuroscience, such as Professor Ian McGilchrist, the concept of divided brain and the sense of the sacred, suggests that the spiritual aspect of human experience, and by implication, the basis of theology as more than merely anthropology or literary study, is neurological. And this seems to place science in some way as superior to religion and theology. How can this be resolved?
It's obvious that anything we do and think has a neurological basis. This is just what it means to be to be embodied persons. But that doesn't mean that the study of neuroscience has any superiority to, say, philosophy of mind or to the intellect, because we wouldn't have neurosciences in the first place if we weren't people with minds and spirits. So I think it's a confusion to say that whatever I think has some neurological basis, and therefore neurology is somehow superior to what I think. I wouldn't have neurosciences without being a spiritual being. So that's my shortcut answer. If you want to have more of it, so the classic modern or contemporary explanation would be in C.S. Lewis' books on miracle, chapter 3, But then you have the similar kind of argument has been run even by Descartes, by Plato, and more recently by Popper, by Plantinga. So, but I think it's really, it's not because there is a neurological substratum that therefore everything or the most important thing is neurological. It's the instrument. They're similar. So if you want to have an example, you could say, oh, I really like piano music, and everything is just the piano, and so you just see how it's played, and therefore but I would still say the concert is mainly about the person playing the piano. And in the same case, so you have a neurological substrate, but it's the mind who plays it, or uses the instrument.
Great, thank you. Do we have another question in the room?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
My name is Koichi Hosoi from Japan. Thank you very much. Your presentation is very, very interesting for me. Thank you. And in last slide, you say myself column, responsibility and I think that is just a little bit opposite word. Responsibility is image for meaning duty, and hope is meaning the spontaneously or automatically. So how do you think about the responsibility and hope? Very, very interesting, that point.
So when so if one accepts the idea that humans are created in the image of God, they have a dignity which doesn't come from what they do, what they achieve. And this is where I think that hope comes in. My value doesn't depend on even on who I am or what people think about me, what I've done in my life, or what I can do. Obviously, it has links to other questions as well. So about people who are not who don't contribute to the economic wealth of society. And so if I accept the idea that humans are created in the image of God, say they have the dignity just by being humans and being created by God. And that applies to the scientists, and this gives us hope.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Okay, that's wonderful. I think we are we're about 30 seconds away from the top of the hour. So maybe time for one more question in the room if we have a quick question. Yeah.
I don't know how quick this is. I'm so interested in the idea of theology being able to inform what science asks, the kind of things that can discover. And you brought up that obviously it's so easy to do that badly, that you can read your own favourite interpretation of scripture and say, science can't find death because I've decided this. I just wondered if you have any pointers on how do we just discern a good use of theology to inform science, both bad and
Obviously, you have to work it out in every case. But I would think part of it is to respect what I would call the integrity of theology and science. So going back to biblical exegesis, I would say somebody doing biblical exegesis should know what's going on in science, and therefore perhaps he or she will go back to a text and then ask new probing questions. And this could happen in the other way, so that, say, takes psychology. I know from theology that humans are sinners, so what is there as psychological evidence? But it doesn't mean that I will now read into my psychological evidence what I've decided on theological grounds. But it means to be open-minded, and to allow perhaps to see certain things which I wouldn't see otherwise. But it doesn't mean twisting the evidence. So respecting the integrity and being, perhaps I would say also accept that there could be conflict, that I don't have to find the resolution to all contradictions just right now. So just be open-minded and rigorous in my, in my research methodology.
Well, Lydia, thank you so much. I think you've really stimulated our thinking about science-engaged theology, but also about theology-engaged science. Really, really interesting. So, yeah, thank you.